Beau, Fadi, je vais vous poser la même question que j'ai adressée à
Perhaps Beau and Fadi, I could now ask you the same question I was asking John. Just now, we're talking about, the promise of aviation, of the aviation industry. Do you think that reducing the scale of growth is an important thing in your respective contexts? In the case of Africa, I would say definitely not. I mean, we have seen a lot of changes in behavior patterns. There used to be a lot of travel between Africa and other continents, but Africa was not particularly fashionable as a destination for tourism. But with the restraints on COVID, we know, of course, that there are a lot of people who have studied abroad who are from Africa and have moved back to settle in Africa. And with the opportunities for discovery, for travel, and of course for visits to the family, there's a lot of potential there. Then you have the African Union policies with the various measures to provide for support through governments and cooperation. There are people nowadays who were able to come to France from Africa with a simple tourist visa, but then they're not able to do that at the present time. So they're looking for other opportunities and trying to discover other parts of of Africa instead. And presumably the crisis will have shaken things up a little bit, and we'll see some changes. But there is a need to invest in new equipment or infrastructures to adapt to these changes, and that's going to cost a lot of money. And we can see the substitutes for aircraft fuel, for example, that are highlighting some of these possibilities. What about you, Shibo? How do you see the post-pandemic prospects up to 2040, for example? Do you think it's important to achieve a kind of reduction in the scale of growth for aviation? To be honest, I'm not in a very good position to answer that one way or the other. What I could say is that, as John was highlighting, there's going to be a downward trend in business travel, since a lot of people have become accustomed to using tools like Zoom or Skype for business meetings. When it comes to family and business, or family and tourism travel, I think there will continue to be an increase. In the case of China, as of course you know, the country has been growing apace, has reached a new stage of development. Many people are dreaming of a better life, and there is that huge segment of the population that has never yet traveled by plane and would love to. For us, we are moving to the 14th five-year plan, which provides for considerable support measures to underpin growth in the country. We're going to have to move to way more airplanes and airports. There's a huge and growing appetite in China for all this, and it would be difficult to say that because of climate concerns, we're just going to have this all grind to a halt. That being said, we are very attentive to what can be done with new technologies, and because of the fact that people can take high-speed trains for distances like between Shanghai and Beijing, for example, rather than planes, there are some changes happening there too.
And for China, the transport sector, aviation in particular, is a pillar for growth in the next steps. And general aviation hasn't been opened up. I think that amongst the audience, there are professionals who are very aware of that. In China, we do not have spaces for private jets. There are Chinese billionaires who have private jets, but they can't travel as they wish. There's still limited space, but this space is going to be freed up probably within a decade or less than 5 years, because there's the economy at stake. When the economy is at stake, it's difficult to say no. So I think that the government, which is also faced with this quandary, on the one hand, you need to find growth, and on the other hand, you need to maintain to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So as a citizen and as a user, I think that for business travel, this is going to decline, but with long holidays and bank holidays, Chinese people love to travel above all. So especially after COVID, Chinese people are going to come back to Paris. Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. Before we give the floor to John, Andrew Murphy, what is the change in business aviation versus leisure aviation since the start of COVID? Are you saying that tourists are going to come back to Europe, especially Paris? Yes, of course. As opposed to business travel, as John said very well, especially for young entrepreneurs, people who love to discuss things, who love to meet other people, they have no problems with going abroad. So I think that for that, work from home and video conferencing works well. But people always love to meet face to face, especially in business. It's all about trust, and you can't establish trust over long distances. You need to meet people. You know that, especially the Chinese, they have a certain code. You need to build trust. It's called Quanxi. You need to have drinks and meals together. Without drinks and good food, you can't do any business. It's cultural. It's also a matter of practices. So I'm rather quite confident about this rebound of tourism from China. Chinese tourists so much want to come back to Paris, but it's not possible for the moment yet. And I can tell you that in Europe as well, we do business over a good meal, especially a good French wine.
For you, would you say, Andrew, that the transport pricing has played a key role in the climate ambitions? And would you say that that is enough?
Well, if we look at the aviation sector, I think there has mostly been a lack of effective carbon pricing over the last decade. And it's one of the reasons why aviation sector's emissions have grown faster than the emissions from other sectors. What I hear said a lot is that, well, aviation is a sector which is difficult to decarbonize. Well, you know, in a way, any sector, any mode of transport is difficult to decarbonize. If you don't make an effort, if you don't put in place some of the basic measures, like putting a proper carbon price on it. And here in Europe, we're seeing, a real phase out of coal, a real phase out of lignite, the worst type of coal, because we have our emissions trading scheme, which supports renewables. I know in China is in the process of establishing its own emissions trading scheme. And in some of the pilot projects has looked to include aviation. 10 years ago in Europe, we tried to include all of our flights to and from in our own emissions trading scheme to put a better price on flying and to set a trajectory, because the cap and trade scheme, the emissions are capped and then decrease over time. Likewise, in the US, there was a similar effort under Obama to put fuel, and none of these happened. And what happened was the sector was left largely untaxed and its emissions unregulated. And, as somebody, I was very interested in Beau's description of sort of the rising prosperity in China and more and more people availing of aviation. I mean, I'm Irish, so my story is different, but there are some similarities. And Ireland being an island, we have benefited very greatly from the expansion of aviation. We've all benefited personally from our ability to travel more, and Ireland has benefited economically. We are now headquarters to some major global companies, part and thanks to our tax regime, but also part and thanks to the ability to stay connected by aviation to different parts of the world. So I get the economic importance of aviation to my country and globally. But our view is, if a sector like aviation is as important as everyone agrees it is, then it's important that we are just as strict on aviation reducing its emissions as we are in every other sector. I don't think it does the aviation sector any favors to give it special treatment and special privileges. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that now. as other sectors which were more strictly regulated, such as the road transport sector, as they begin to cut their emissions, we're seeing the consequence of the special treatment. I agree with John in that there has been a change in industry position on aviation. They've given up on the idea that, well, we'll just buy some more fuel-efficient aircraft. That will be enough. But I think industry still has to go one step further and recognize that actually what we need is much more aggressive, and I think aggressive is the right word, aggressive government regulations to drive down emissions in the sector. A lot more aggressive pricing, capping of emissions, targets to reduce them. I know under the new administration in the US, the American airlines have been more active. They have been talking about tax breaks for alternative fuels. I think tax breaks can play a role. I don't think you can cut taxes, keep cutting taxes as the sole means of reducing your emissions. If that was the best way and the only way to reduce emissions, climate policy would be a lot more popular. But on top of tax cuts, which can be important, there's also the necessity to set in place binding targets. And I think the aviation sector needs to recognize that it's in their best interests to have such binding targets.
On va passer dans quelques minutes à une session
In a few minutes, we're going to move on to a Q&A session. So don't hesitate to ask your questions. You can see the address at the bottom of your screen. I'll ask John to
tell us what you
respond
think about what
to what
Andrew
Andrew
just
said.
Aggressive government regulation is key. Do you think Biden's administration is moving towards that action, that type of action?
I think it's too early to know precisely in what directions the Biden administration will go, but I think that regulation is coming for sure if airlines don't do more. And so aggressive is a word I'd use. I think we're seeing signals of that now that Trump is gone and Biden is here from the airline community, that they're going to up the game on sustainable aviation fuels. They're going to use the opportunity of the decline in traffic demand to retire old fleet models that burn more fuel. But getting to zero emissions is not going to happen overnight. The question is what combination of technology, of changes in passenger behavior, such as reductions in business travel, and then economic measures, perhaps via regulation, what combination is correct. I would note one thing: if business travel does decline, that will change significantly the economic calculus for airlines. By one computation I recall, business travelers, the people paying for premium class travel, maybe they're only 12 to 15% of all passengers on board, but they can be as much as 75% of the revenues. If you see a significant 10, 20, 30% or more decline in business travelers, airlines are going to have to figure out how to be profitable, and that's probably going to mean flying fewer airplanes. So I think we'll see some changes there long term. It's really hard with an unprecedented pandemic affecting travel in such an extraordinary way to know how we'll come out on the other side of this. But I do see a role for regulation in the future and for goals, but I'm not sure what the mix will be. The best thing would be to let people travel as much as they decide they want to, taking into consideration the moral component of every time you fly, you are creating additional emissions. But find ways through technology to address, or through other offset schemes to address the carbon emissions costs of flying. And they're not accounted for right now fully.
John, you just mentioned business travel has been decreasing, but however, habits or bad habits are hard to cut. Would you say that the American population is ready for a change? When we talk travel in terms of visiting friends and relatives, do you see any change that is possible in those habits with the American population?
I wish I could be more optimistic, but I think realism is what you're asking for, Sophie. And to be realistic, I think we'll see a resurgence in individual personal travel that may not take us to the earlier levels, but probably will. So I don't think that visiting friends and relatives travel is going to decline significantly in the long term in the absence of other measures.
Fadi, est-ce que j'aimerais vous faire...
Sorry, go ahead. I don't think that flight shaming has penetrated the American psyche in the way that perhaps it has in Europe. I think there's a real difference there, and that's a challenge for Americans, to be honest.
On peut peut-être poser la question à Fadi de ce
Maybe we can ask
shaming.
Fadi the same question about flight shaming. It's not at all topical in Africa, is it?
On imagine, Fadi.
I can imagine.
J'ai pas suivi Sophie.
Sorry, I didn't hear. The flight shaming, this is now a very trendy and controversial term now. Shaming people for flying, it's not at all a concern for Africans who travel. And anyway, what's the distinction you could make about business and leisure air transport in Africa? What's the trend? Well, Sophie, as I said earlier, flight shaming is not established in our habits because flying is quite an event in Africa. If you go to an airport and when you see that somebody in the family is traveling, it's something huge. So I always look at the regions to look at trends. I don't know why some regions like mine would benefit less from flying, but business air transport is less developed in a lot of areas. It's not well ingrained yet. If you take a country like Nigeria, where most business travelers have their own jet, sometimes I'm trying to look for aircraft for my customers to travel in Central Africa. It's really difficult. There's really a gap between regions and countries in Africa. I always raise that issue with the main players. You can't have a region that's very concentrated with excess capacity and other regions where there are unmet needs. I personally experienced it. I'll share this experience with you. I had Australian investors who came to Cameroon on a mission, and they needed to visit mining sites. And so for 3 days, on average, they had 50,000 euros, but in 3 days we weren't able to find them a plane or a helicopter to do these visits. So I like to share such experiences with my audience because you can see that in our countries, we still have everything to do because it contributes greatly to the development of other sectors and government. So for us, aviation is not a luxury. It's a facilitator for the development of other sectors. So I would not say that it even crosses people's minds. Flying is very expensive, and so we're asking governments to help reduce the cost of travel for people, but be reassured if you ask airports about statistics for the number of Africans who went to Dubai or open countries even during the pandemic, you'll see that the trend is still fairly low. Another question for Bo or Andrew, if we have time before the Q&A. Bo, Chinese-American economic relations took a beating under Trump. Are they going to get better under Biden? But of course, that had an impact on tourism and travel between the two countries, I guess. That was one of the main consequences on top of COVID, I think. Well, yes, it came to a full stop because of the confrontation in all areas, starting with trade, and then high-tech, and then finance, and the big Chinese corporations in Wall Street were sort of blacklisted, and then they advocated decoupling. But if you advocate for decoupling, well, you realize that it compounds the problems of COVID. But under Biden, things may get better. The new administration is highly aware that in a lot of global issues, China is an essential player to save the planet, and so we need to work hand in hand with everybody. Going it alone and punishing China with trade tariffs is not the right method, especially since we now live in a globalized world. And so to save the aviation sector, as you know, for all grounded aircrafts, we need this mutual shared recovery. We are fond of US students and investors coming to China and vice versa. And for that, you need to build up trust. And so when we're all vaccinated, if we can find the right solution, that's the main challenge. We still have a few minutes left before the Q&A, so I wanted to ask Andrew.
Mobility is a good thing, of course, but pollution is a bad one. So how do you see that your think tank, TNE, can help build a better and safer world in the next decades?
Well, I'd stress TNE is a sustainable transport NGO organization. If we were a climate organization, we would be saying stop flying tomorrow. We want a sustainable aviation future. I want personally to be able to fly and visit my family. I think the most important thing TNE does as an NGO is just put pressure on an industry in a way which is constructive and help try and draw some connections between what's happening in other parts of the climate debate. And I think there is a lot we can learn. I mean, I'm interested, here we have a dialogue with representatives from the US and from China, from those respective countries. And I think it raises the question, are we competing to reduce emissions from aviation, or are we cooperating to reduce aviation emissions, or is it a combination of the two? And in some respects in climate policy, what's worked best in other sectors is kind of a mix of the both. We're cooperating under the Paris Agreement, where we're all, thankfully, since the coming to office of Joe Biden, we're cooperating in that we've all become parties to this agreement. We're also competing to some extent in the technology and in capturing the market, and both speaking, very proudly of the battery industry in China and how that's accelerating. I think we need to introduce that same level of cooperation and competition in decarbonizing aviation. I think there's been a little too much sort of cozy cooperation on ICAO, where we all get together and try and get 190 countries to agree on everyone. I would like the US, Europe, China to maybe compete on the first zero-emission aircraft. I would like these groups to compete on, ramping up zero-emission fuels. I think a little bit of competition would be no harm in reducing emissions from aviation, and I hope my NGO can contribute in some ways towards that competition and that race.
Are you overall optimistic, Andrew? Oh, Andrew, I was just asking, are you overall optimistic?
I should be, because there are reasons to be optimistic. I think COVID has shown that we can do great things, both in developing the vaccines and in changing our lifestyles. So I should be optimistic. I think what always tempers my optimism a bit is when I see some people continue to downplay the challenge the aviation sector faces. Because it is a substantial challenge. The aviation sector is a decade, 2 decades behind other modes, other parts of the economy in decarbonizing. It is substantially behind. And, no one in the aviation sector should kid themselves about how far behind they are and how much trouble they are and the challenge which lies ahead. I think if everyone was a bit more aware of that challenge and a bit more aware of how the aviation sector is behind other sectors, I'd be a little more optimistic. But I think that's the main thing holding me back.
All right. I think we're going to move to the question and answer session now. On va doucement basculer vers notre session de...
So we're going to switch to the question and answers session now.
Il y a pas mal de questions déjà qui nous sont
adressées. A number of questions have arrived already, and so thank you for taking part. The first concern is travel is a factor of civilization. It is indeed a factor of peace and progress. So, Fatih, maybe you want to take that comment.
Est-ce que vous m'avez entendu, Fadi?
Did you hear this question?
Oui, je vous ai entendu.
Yeah, yes, I certainly did hear it.
Allez-y.
Oui.
Well, as I was saying myself, we all know, and I've said this time and again, Africa is trying to catch up with the rest of the world, at least with developed countries, and so obviously flying is part of it. And indeed, for all observers of the industry, they'll realize that governments have been keenly involved in the development of the air industry, because that is what it takes to become a modern economy. Of course, there's new technologies, but of course, the younger generation, they still want to travel. I mean, the safest way of traveling is by air. Otherwise, you're talking about a 45-day journey to go from A to B.
Biden's administration is taking action to address climate issue, but according to you, with what consequence on national air transportation?
It's not clear. Sophie, I wish I had a good answer for you there. I'm no longer in the U.S. government, and we're just in the early weeks of the Biden administration. What I think does matter, and you asked Andrew earlier, is he optimistic? I would say I'm a hell of a lot more optimistic than I was last October before our elections. I think the will is there to do something, but exactly how it will happen, I don't know. The United States has continued, just with recent legislation, to put money into the U.S. airlines so that they can survive, so that they can keep their employees, so that they can bounce back to the way, at least sort of like they were before. Climate change remains a controversial subject in the United States in a way that I do not believe it is in Europe, for sure. Biden has won a majority. He is the president, but our Congress is rather evenly divided. There's a lot of opposition to economic measures to limit growth. The United States has traditionally been all about growth, and that includes growth in aviation. So I think it's going to be a big challenge, but luckily we have an administration, we have a president, a secretary of transportation, we have a climate czar or envoy in John Kerry, so many capable people who are committed to change. How they get there, how politically they'll be successful, that remains to be seen. I wish I could be more concrete. I just can't.
Question pour Shu Bo. Pourriez-vous...
Thank you. A question for Shu Bo. Can you tell us about the plans in China for alternative fuels, SAFs and others? Well, I'm not that well up on these issues. I mean, I can speak as a citizen, but what I can tell you is the Chinese government has been very pragmatic when it comes to decarbonizing the energy. The emphasis now is on batteries for electric cars, but there will be tomorrow batteries for electric-powered planes. Well, you have drones being used right now, and the Chinese are manufacturing, are great manufacturers of drones, and the drones are non-polluting. So regarding, well, the aviation sector is, of course, quintessential for economic growth, and economic growth is very much needed in China. So it is being preserved and protected, but in so doing, people try and use other modes of transport when they can, high-speed trains, electric cars. So regarding long-haul flights, of course, aviation does remain has pride of place, because it is, of course, the obvious solution. We find that travel is a factor of peace. Even within China, people want to know people from other provinces. They want to travel within the country. And of course, the airfares are on the way down, at least, air travel is becoming more affordable. So there's no reason why people should travel less. But of course, we have a big population, and the slightest mistake might deal a fatal blow to the industry. So there's, of course, this pollution, but there are other factors as well. And I think that a good cooperation between citizens and the governments, I do believe that we should arrive at a happy solution, and the issue of air pollution by air transport will find a solution.
Do you believe that all countries need to work together on reducing gas emission, no matter their development level? Do you think all countries should be together and work on that question together? Andrew and John, or John or Andrew? Both.
Yeah, I think we've got a pretty good sort of principle in climate policy and in the Paris Agreement. We should all be aiming towards that goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to balance out our greenhouse gas emissions by the second half of the century. We should all be establishing net zero targets. China has its for 2060, Europe for 2050. I think there's different actions different parts of the world can take. 90% of aviation emissions come from either a Boeing or an Airbus aircraft. I think that shows Europe and the US have an important role to play in regulating these huge aircraft manufacturers. China, of course, has its own ambitions with COMAC. And of course, how China decides COMAC is going to grow and going to develop. Will it become a manufacturer which prioritizes efficiency and zero emissions over price or some other consideration? I think that will be very important. If you're an aircraft manufacturing bloc, you have a very important role to play. I think other blocs have roles to play in developing fuels and looking what the resources are. I certainly think there's a role for everyone to play in this. It may just vary depending on what their expertise is.
John, what is your position on that? Do you think all countries should work together on that issue?
Oh, absolutely. They should work together. But as Andrew underscored, how they can do that, what their contributions are, and what their needs are can be quite different. Fatimatu's made a good point about Africa needs aviation. The railroads don't exist in the same way they do in China or in Europe. The road system, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is virtually non-existent. Aviation is an essential role in the future development of Africa. In the United States, the aviation system is quite mature. The issue is huge demand. People want to travel. The United States needs to pursue measures it can, Europe measures it can, China it can, and Africa that it can, but the needs for further development of aviation differ around the world. So yes to cooperation, but that doesn't mean an undifferentiated single approach by all the economies of the world. It needs to be different too.
Une question pour Choubo. Pouvez-vous, vous nous avez parlé de l'avion
question for
électrique.
Choubo. You mentioned the possible electric-powered plane, but what can China do today to generate or create electricity? Can it generate green power? Does it have green batteries? Because when you look at the batteries, the whole supply chain does involve quite a bit of pollution, doesn't it? Listen, I'm not an expert either in batteries or in aviation, but I know that Chinese manufacturers are very good at making batteries, especially for electric cars. And that is why this is a flourishing business. And I believe that electric cars will be a pillar of Chinese industry, of Chinese manufacturing industry, in years to come. And that is why Europeans and Americans, in fact, are investing massively in electric cars. there's also nuclear energy, and there we have to thank France for this. We have a relationship dating back to the 1980s, where we've been building our own nuclear power plants. There's wind power energy and so on. But when President Xi Jinping committed before the UN General Assembly that China should be carbon neutral by 2060. When the president says this, well, you'd better believe it. This is a very disciplined country, and so you can take the president at his word. Indeed, a number of cities have embarked on major plans towards the energy transition and the environmental transition as part of the recovery plan after the COVID crisis. Green industries will get again pride of place. It is the case in China, and it is true in other parts of the world as well. Of course, it remains to be seen just how we will be able to share with others, with Europeans, Africans, and Americans, to share our own developments, but that has to be reciprocal. Maybe we have something to learn from our neighbors. The issue, I mean, pollution is a global challenge, and there's no two ways about it. We have to work hand in hand. And of course, China is more than prepared to work with its neighbors, especially as regards clean energies. We have to work with the international community. Well, thank you, because there are many, many questions indeed. The next question for Vadim Matou. Air transport is essential for the development of Africa. You said so in so many words, but the probable transition to substitute fuels much more expensive than jet fuel, and indeed the need for expensive infrastructure, will that mean that air transport will become more expensive, and how can Africa overcome that? Well, as I was saying, Sophie, Africa stands ready. In Africa, we have lots of sun, and solar energy is being harnessed. Having said that, we still need a transfer of technology for those countries that do have the resources. They may have lots of sun or wind, but the manufacturers of that technology, of these technologies, still have yet to consider Africa as a conducive place to invest. And yet Africa does have resources. When we look at projects to build dams or roads, the French Development Agency always gets involved. But likewise, we believe that the French AFD, the French Development Agency, should also promote the development of the air industry involving these new green and clean technologies. Africa has a wealth of natural resources. It stands ready to take on the new technologies, but what is needed is to work hand in hand with developed countries to reach these objectives. I have a question for all four of you, if I may. Some of the European youth is very much taken by that injunction not to fly.
Slogan. So what message would you like to address to them? Maybe Andrew and John first, and then Bo and Fadi.
I think, John, you went first last time. Maybe you want to go first this time?
Oh, you put the onus on me, but fair enough. I think the younger generation is much more attuned to the challenges, part because they've grown up with climate change being an issue, and in part because the future world is their world, not mine. I'll be pushing daisies perhaps before 2050. Good chance of that. So I think a younger generation will look at whether a flight is necessary. They won't stop flying totally, not at all. They'll continue to fly, but they will look to whether certain trips are necessary, and they will also look to, coming back to this issue of possible competition in the area, they'll look at whether a particular airline or a particular country is doing better than average or worse than average in deciding what sort of flight they'll take. They'll be supportive of measures to decarbonize aviation. I think they'll look to the U.S. government in any event to incentivize sustainable aviation fuels, to work on the very huge challenges of carbon capture and sequestration. So I think there's a future there for less flying and for less carbonizing flying.
Andrew, what message to the younger generation?
For me,
go ahead, Andrew.
Sorry, yeah, I think they are correct, and I think unless the aviation sector manages to catch up with other sectors, in last year in Europe, 10% of all cars sold were 10% were electric vehicles. We're still at 0% of clean fuels, 0% of clean aircraft. So their voices are going to become more and more numerous so long as aviation continues to be behind other sectors. And so I think we do have to listen very seriously to what they're saying.
Beau, quel message adressé aux jeunes générations?
Beau, what is your message to new generations? Beau's microphone has been muted.
Allez-y, on ne vous entend. Non.
Oh dear, we still can't hear Beau. All right, well, look, for the time being, let's give the floor to Fadi Matou. What would be your message to the young generation? Well, look, I myself was fortunate to travel around the world. I went to America, to Europe, Asia. I haven't been to Australia yet, but I've visited as many as 40 African countries, and my message to the younger generation in developed countries, and indeed this applies to us, young professionals, my message is that we, or the younger generation, should be able to become aware of impending developments, should be aware of reality, and should share knowledge using the social media. When you see a young person in America, in Asia, or in America, or in Europe or in America, well, this is nothing to do with the situation you find in African cities, even developed cities. So if you are to build a future industry, you'll have to build international programs, such programs as Champion, where youth can cooperate, because a young European say you shouldn't fly, whereas the dream of any African youth is indeed to fly. So they are at loggerheads, and the best way to overcome this is to have better exchanges using maybe new communication technologies. Is Sue Beau available to? Yes, your microphone had been muted. We can hear you. Yes, can you hear me? We can hear you. Yes. Yeah, be careful with your microphone. Yes. Well, thank you for this invitation. Before winding up, let me just say that youth has a message to convey, but it has to be, of course, qualified. It all depends on where you live. Various countries have various stages of development, and the needs, of course, are not the same. The aspirations are not the same. You mentioned Africa. If you told the Chinese they should stop flying, that might seem a bit odd, because just like Africa, youth wants to fly. So maybe you could say, well, travel when you have to, and of course, well, there's always a need. Earlier on, we were saying that there are international relations. I mean, we world in a globalized world where exchanges are needed and where we need to meet. And of course, that isn't possible without airplanes. At the same time, you have to protect the environment, and that is the balancing act. That is what you have to keep in mind. On the one hand, you have to be aware of problems, of challenges, and at the same time, you see what can reasonably be done. There are engineers here listening in, and they know that solutions can be found to create aircraft that are environmentally friendly. And that is the way out. Well, of course, these will be the concluding words. Thank you so very much to all of you for taking part in this panel. I would like to thank Farimatu, Sue Bo, Andrew.
Thank you for this very relevant and interesting points that you have developed. Thank you so much. On va passer à la session de conclusion tout de suite.